issue number 7, continued, part 3. Pomeroy Tucker was born in Palmyra, New York in 1802, 3 years before Joseph Smith. He is considered to be a contemporary source. This is what he said about Joseph Smith. Quote, Joseph had learned to read comprehensively, reading works of fiction and records of criminality, such, for instance, as would be classed with the dime novels of the present day. The stories of Stephen Buroughs and Captain Kidd and the like presented the highest charms for his expanding mental perceptions. This is quoted from Mormonism, Its Origin, Rise, and Progression, and Progress. Some apologists say that Tucker's Mormonism, Its Origin, Rise, and Progress is anti-Mormon, and thus anything in the book cannot be trusted. If this is true, why then did LDS scholar and church history compiler B.H. Roberts quote Tucker for background information on Joseph Smith? Also, Fair Mormon has an article in which they quote Tucker's book 4 times as support for Joseph, and they even refer to Tucker as an eyewitness to Joseph and his family. Is Tucker's peripheral information only useful and accurate when it shows Joseph and the church in a positive and favorable light? Again, quoting, We are sorry to observe, even in this enlightened age, so prevalent a disposition to credit the accounts of the marvelous. Even the frightful stories of money being hid under the surface of the earth and enchanted by the devil or Robert Kidd, also called Captain Kidd, are received by many of our respectable fellow citizens as truths. Published in the Wayne Sentinel, Palmyra, New York, February 16, 1825. Notice that this is considered prevalent and received by many of our respectable fellow citizens as truths. The above contemporary newspaper quote from Palmyra, New York in 1825 was not tainted by any desire to damage Joseph Smith. This article provides a snapshot of the worldview of 1825 New England. The Hill Cumorah and Moroni have absolutely nothing to do with Cumorah and Moroni from Captain Kidd stories that Joseph and his treasure-hunting family, friends, and community were familiar with. The original 1830 Book of Mormon just happens to have the uniform Cumorah spelling. This is all just a mere coincidence. Of course, those are all questions. And then a final update, additional information and analysis can be found at this link, which is another page on this website. Okay, let's talk about Pomeroy Tucker for just a moment. It says here, he's used by B.H. Roberts, and there's an article on Fair Mormon that references this book of Mormonism, Its Origin, Rise, and Progress. And so their claim is that you either have to use this for everything, you have to say everything in it is correct, or you have to say nothing in it is correct. And if they're going to use it for any purpose, then it is usable for every purpose. Now this is horrible history. This is just a horrible way to approach history. See, every record has its proper use and its improper use. So, I mean, even, the Grimm's fairy tales, they have a proper historical use because they give us a history of the progress of folk tales. And they show us the kind of stories that people were telling. You want to do a history on literature, you can't skip over the Grimm's fairy tales. They are an integral part of that folk tale history. But if you're going to try and use them to tell the history of the kings of England, you're way off base. They don't tell you that. In the same way, Pomeroy Tucker, he did, as he said, he was born in 1802 in Palmyra. He was there to witness when the Smith family moved in. He makes a lot of claims in his books. In this book, he makes a lot of claims, but what is the proper use of that book in historical work? In the they mention B.H. Roberts, but they don't give any references to it. They just say he used it. He might have, I don't know. Haven't found any direct references to B.H. Roberts using it. But he was a church historian. The idea that he would have referenced it for certain purposes, perfectly normal. I've got no problem with it. But this is where they fail to realize that I've actually read the article that they cite for Fair Mormon. In this article, So they make it appear that they're using Pomeroy Tucker as the basis for what the article is saying. So they quote him 4 times as support for Joseph Smith. That's not what they're saying. When you actually look at this article is written in response to the claim that Joseph Smith's account of what was going on in New York when he first moved into Palmyra was inaccurate. People were trying to say that Joseph Smith's recorded history that he wrote himself did not mesh with what was recorded in other places. And so in this Fair Mormons article, they point out that this claim is false. As one source, they actually use more often than anybody else, they use Joseph's mother, Lucy Mack Smith. That she agrees with every point that Joseph Smith makes, point by point. They also use 4 or 5 sources total, Pomeroy Tucker being one of them. But they use Pomeroy Tucker not as a basis for the argument, but more to say that the critics of the church who make this claim are being disproven by an anti-Mormon. They're saying Pomeroy Tucker, even in his book that is so critical of the church, that is so critical of Joseph Smith, even he agrees to the same points that Joseph Smith makes about his history. And so the specific claims that this article is addressing are rightly supported by what Pomeroy Tucker has written in his book. That does not mean that every claim written by Pomeroy Tucker is accurate and should be taken as gospel fact. No. It means that those specific claims that have been made regarding the history that Joseph Smith wrote are proven false because not only did Joseph Smith say it, not only did his mother say it, but one of his primary detractors said it. That's all it is. So yeah, we can look at this book of Mormonism, its origin, rise, and progress. And we can say, okay, he got some things right, but most of this stuff is just nonsense. And most of it was. See, most of his book is actually based on the previous book known as Mormonism Unveiled. And that book contained a pile of affidavits which have been completely discredited by history, but which are primarily just reproduced in Pomeroy Tucker's book. There are even some people who made public statements saying that Pomeroy Tucker never even attempted to verify these affidavits. There's one guy, he makes this statement that he was living, I was living next to him, Pomeroy Tucker lived next to me, and he never once even came to ask me about that statement that is credited to me in the book Mormonism Unveiled before he reprinted it in his book. So yeah, we can show a progression. We can show that his book is largely based on another book that was discredited at the time of Joseph Smith at the time that Pomeroy Tucker was writing. The book Mormonism Unveiled had already been discredited to a large extent, and now is completely disregarded as having any accuracy to Joseph Smith or the rise and progress of the church. And yet it is the basis for Pomeroy Tucker's book. Okay, that's point number 1. Okay, after dealing with Pomeroy Tucker, let us look at this other quote that they give here. This is from the Wayne Sentinel, Palmyra, New York, printed in February 16th, 1825. This would have been about 2 years after Moroni first appeared to Joseph Smith. So the story of Joseph Smith, this vision, would have circulated somewhat, although at this point I don't know how much would have been known. So let us look at this quote one more time, just briefly. Sorry to report in the Enlightened period that people are taking the idea of a hidden cursed treasure so seriously. Now, I actually went to the link they give here, and the full article talks about a guy in Vermont claiming to have had some kind of a vision telling him where a chest was buried, and taking some men out and going and digging up. When they found the chest, They find it nearly empty, and suddenly it just disappears. So the story that they present does seem rather ridiculous. But then the letter here points out that this quote says that it is prevalent, that it is received by many respectable fellow citizens as truths. And they are therefore assuming, they say, oh, because it was prevalent, because a lot of people were giving credence to these claims, well, then we should just believe that Joseph Smith and his family also gave credence to these claims. But because a lot of people were, then these specific people obviously were. And that's that's logical fallacy again. Because clearly not everybody was. Some people were, some respectable citizens were, but not everybody was, and there is no direct evidence to support that Joseph Smith or his family did. It is an assumption that is being made based on statements like this. There are other statements and other sources talking about the prevalence of this kind of belief. But there is never any direct statements by a reputable source showing that Joseph Smith or his family ever believed it. There is the story, it did happen, that Joseph Smith, I don't know if it was him and his father or him and his brother, I can't remember, but they were hired to dig for treasure by Josiah Stowell, because he had heard that the Spanish had abandoned a silver mine in the area and he was trying to find it. There was no talk of any supernatural guardians of it. Those were all rumors that were later spread, and it was actually Joseph Smith that would later convince Mr. Stowell to stop looking for it. Saying, you're wasting money doing this, you should just stop. There's even a court case in which Joseph Smith was brought up on charges, I believe, by Josiah Stowell's children, in which Josiah Stowell himself testified in favor of Joseph Smith and got the charges dismissed. So, did Joseph Smith dig for treasure? Yes, because he was hired to do it, not because he believed it in himself. He was hired and he needed money. There is no direct evidence that Joseph Smith or anybody in his family believed in hidden pirate treasure or in spiritual guardians of this treasure. Was that a common belief in New England at the time? Yes. That doesn't mean it was held by Joseph Smith or his family. Now, I will also point out, they make the statement here that says the above contemporary newspaper quote from Palmyra was not tainted by any desire to damage Joseph Smith. See, now they're assuming motivations that they have no direct evidence for. I will point out, I'll actually say, I don't think there's any evidence that at this time there was any desire to damage or taint Joseph Smith or his family. I don't see that, but there is definite evidence of it later on in the fact that a number of years later they were printing articles that were not favorable to Joseph Smith, and they even managed to get a hold of a copy of the title page of the Book of Mormon before it was printed. They stole a copy of the title page from the printer so that they could print it in their newspaper before it was printed by the printer. So, while they may not have had any antagonistic feelings towards Joseph Smith when they printed this particular article, and I will even point out this article makes no mention of Joseph Smith or anything connected with him, these people did later become antagonistic, and how much of that antagonism existed before or during the time of this article is a matter of speculation, not a matter of proven fact. Now, just to wrap this whole thing up, all 3 points, they do have this final comment here where they just ask if it's all a coincidence or not. And again, for the main point of the article, the similarities of names, yes, it is a coincidence. But it is a logical coincidence given the history and heritage of the peoples involved. Everything else is meaningless, because every point made in this issue is easily explained by the fact of a shared heritage. So, is it a coincidence? Yes, but it is logical. The issue is truly a non-issue to those who actually believe. It is only an issue for those who want to disbelieve. And I will wrap it up here. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe, and tune in next time.